They knew what he did, but the law couldn't touch him. This case is so frustrating because we know who the killer was and we know what he did. But this killer was never charged and he walked free. So today, we're looking at the story of the man who was never caught. It all started back in 1984 when a boy by the name of Evan Zander was out playing with his friends. Now this day was April the 16th, and Evan's mother had just served him a breakfast of pancakes and eggs before he went out to play. And not long after he left, she got a phone call from another mother. The other mother told her that Evan was over at their house and they were going to take him to school, so she wasn't worried. She thought maybe he just didn't want to walk home. But then at around 3:30 p.m., when Evan still hadn't returned home, she began to get worried. That was really out of character for him to stay out for so long. So she called up the police and reported him missing. Officers found Evan's bike abandoned near some railroad tracks, and the last place anyone had seen him was on a surveillance tape. The tape showed him walking into a white van that was driven by an unknown man. It was also noted that Evan had $120 in his pocket, which was probably given to him by his mother for an upcoming school trip. This meant that whoever took Evan wanted him to go willingly. He wasn't kidnapped against his will. But who would do such a thing? The initial investigation turned up nothing, but 2 months later, a hunter came across a girl's jacket in a wooded area about 4 miles from Evan's house. A few days later, they came back to the same area and found human bones. Then 3 more girls came forward saying that they had been approached by a man matching the same description, driving a white van. And the man would ask them if they wanted a ride. Thankfully, they said no and ran off. But now the police had enough evidence to start rounding up every single man with a white van for questioning. And they soon came across Gary Ridgeway, a 41-year-old drifter who drove a white van. However, Gary denied knowing anything about Evan's disappearance and even offered to take a polygraph test. But as the years went on and there were still no answers, the case eventually went cold. That was until a similar case popped up in a different state. In 1985, a young boy named Jacob Anderson went missing. His mother had dropped him off at school, but when she picked him up later that day, he was nowhere to be found. The police investigation turned up very little. They found Jacob's bike abandoned near a supermarket, and a witness saw a man matching the same description as the previous case luring Jacob toward his van. Soon after, Jacob went missing, but this time they weren't able to collect DNA evidence. So Gary Ridgeway was never officially considered a suspect, even though he did fit the description. Over the next decade, 8 more children disappeared, and each case was eerily similar. In every case, the victim was a young boy. And in almost every case, they were lured away from a public area and were never seen again. At this point, everyone believed that there was a serial killer on the loose. But as you can imagine, with so many cases to look through, it's nearly impossible to find one killer among all of them. So the case remained unsolved, and people just hoped that these serial killers would eventually stop. But unfortunately, they didn't. On February the 13th, 1998, a young boy by the name of Joshua James went missing. After leaving his home to walk to school, just like all the other cases, Joshua was never seen again. The police collected DNA evidence from this crime scene and entered it into the system. But once again, there were no matches. Just 3 weeks later, a couple of hikers came across a girl's body in a wooded area. It appeared to have been there for quite some time, and she had blunt force trauma to the head. The police identified her as one of the missing victims and finally linked all of the cases together. There was now enough evidence to issue an arrest warrant, but as you might have guessed, Gary Ridgeway was nowhere to be found. Now, over the next year or so, the police focused on building up their case against Gary, and in January of 2001, he was finally arrested for all the murders that he committed. But it wasn't easy proving that he was guilty. At first, he tried to plead not guilty. But then he changed his plea to guilty in exchange for 49 years in prison. However, this is where things get interesting. While Gary was in prison, the detectives continued to investigate the case, and it turned out that Gary had been lying. He actually committed way more murders than anyone knew. Gary agreed to show the police where some of the bodies were, but he only revealed the location of 4 of the victims. To this day, 49 of the victims are still missing, and their bodies have never been found. And while it's assumed that Gary is responsible for all of them, he was only charged for 5 of the murders. And here's why. Back in 1974, Gary murdered a woman by the name of Mary Lee Downey. He hit her in the head with a crow skull and then buried her in a shallow grave. But in 1974, there was no DNA testing, so he could not be charged for her murder. Fast forward a few years, and Gary is already serving 49 years in prison. So the police decided to dig up the old case and see if they could link Gary to the murder of Mary Lee Downey. They extracted DNA from the body and compared it to Gary's DNA, and sure enough, it matched. But even though he had already confessed to the other murders, he denied killing Mary Lee Downey. But the police had enough evidence to charge him, and so he was given an additional 25 years in prison. This begs the question, why hasn't he been charged with all of the other murders? Well, it comes down to money. For starters, many of the victims' families don't want the trial to be reopened. Okay, they've already accepted the fact that Gary's responsible, and reopening the case would just bring them more pain and suffering. Not to mention, it will cost taxpayers hundreds of thousands of dollars. And for Gary, it doesn't really matter if he's charged with the other crimes. He's already in prison, and he'll die in prison. But if you ask me, the man should be charged for every crime he committed. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. If you want to see my short videos, check out my other content.